And today I want to talk to you about what I think is a really underutilized kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, which is the collaboration between the disciplines of linguistic anthropology and computational linguistics. And I'm going to make my case for the fact that people like me and people like you should collaborate more by talking about a specific case study for a research project where I was working with a lot of NLP and machine learning scientists that just ended a few months ago. So that's the Metaphor project. So my case isn't specifically, I'm not going to say, I can only work on Metaphor. What I'm going to say is linguistic anthropology and natural language processing work really well together, and I'm going to show you how well it worked in this specific research project. All right, so one thing that I do, I had a research and consulting company called Worthwhile Research and Consulting. It's called that in part because no one can say or spell my last name, which is Wertheim. But also because I only want to do worthwhile work, right? So only stuff that is good for the world, makes the world a place of more understanding, more functional. And for the last 5 or so years, I've been consulting and working on projects with computer scientists, AI and NLP people, and when they overlap as well. And what I've learned, especially in the last few years, is that social science really can facilitate natural language processing. So I have my little equation, NLP plus linguistic anthropology equals better results. I just realized that the slide makes it look like it's minus NLP, but that's just the sub-bullet, so blame PowerPoint. All right, so linguistic anthropology does a terrible PR job out there in the world. Basically, anytime I would say to people, I'd say, oh, what do you teach? I would say, linguistic anthropology? Like, you've never heard of it, and you're gonna be frightened now to talk to me. And so let me just very briefly give you a 2-second background on linguistic anthropology. It's one of the 4 branches of American anthropology. The other 3 are cultural, physical, and then archaeology. So people have heard a little bit more about those. There's a lot of overlap with sociolinguistics. So if you're coming from a linguistics department and took sociolinguistics, there's a lot of overlap. But you know, with any discipline, you have to refine yourself, right? So I taught in anthropology departments. I was a linguistic anthropologist. At the most basic level, what we do is we study contextualized language use. So anytime a person is speaking or writing in a given speech event in a given context, that is potential data for a linguistic anthropologist. So linguistics tends to extract from context and work on grammatical systems in the more abstract. Linguistic anthropology works with grammar, but always in a contextualized moment. So what this means is that we end up with an analytical toolkit that is almost insanely broad, right? It's a very broad, contextualized language use happens everywhere all the time, and all of it is available to study as a linguistic anthropologist. So we end up with very broad research applications, right? So we can go, oop, I just lost my slide, sorry. We can go as macro level as the level of the nation. So you look at things like linguistic elements of nation building, and you can go as micro level as components of conversational turns in a recorded dialogue, right? So just 2 people speaking and the recording, and not just the turn, but something within the turn. So it can go very high and go very low. What are some of the ways that linguistic anthropology is applied to the world? So as I said, any language use in a given context is available for analysis. And so everybody who has a PhD in linguistic anthropology, and it tends to be at the PhD level, people who go out in the world and do stuff. The training, for example, a dissertation involves extensive field work. So you have to go to a place and decide, when you're there, you already have something that's interesting to you. But you have to locate, you immerse yourself in what's going on, and then you locate and you analyze the most meaningful elements in a given situation. So I'll use myself as an example. So I wanted to write a dissertation on language endangerment, on theories and pathways of language endangerment. Specifically, why did the grammar of a subordinate language become more like the grammar of the dominant language, but not vice versa? Why the asymmetry? So what I did was I went to Russia for a year. I went to a city you probably haven't heard of, in a republic called Tatarstan, which you probably also haven't heard of. And I spent a year observing and recording linguistic and cultural data. Then I came back to Berkeley, actually Oakland, and I spent a really long time analyzing it and writing my dissertation. And it turned out that the meaningful linguistic elements were really wide-ranging. They were language engineering and purification, so Tatars were saying, we want all the Russian out of our language. They were code switching. When people would talk to each other, they would switch languages. There was style shifting. When was it appropriate to speak in a particular way? There were discourse markers, so people were saying however or listen in interesting ways. Then there was, much to my surprise, morphosyntax. If you had told me going in that I was going to look at morphosyntax in my dissertation, I would have said, hell no, but I did. So there's a certain element of going in and being prepared to find what's interesting and then analyzing it. So I want to talk now for the rest of the time about this case study that is a metaphor project that I worked on for the last 3 years. So this was a project funded by IARPA. It ran from 2012 to 2015. They chose 6 interdisciplinary university-based research teams. Actually, one was based at BBN, but mostly universities. We started out the program with 6 teams, and we had to make performance benchmarks twice a year. By the end of the program, we were down to 3. I was on a team. I was invited to be part of a team led by USC, their Information Sciences Institute, which you might be familiar with. It's a lot of AI and NLP work down there, down in Marina Del Rey, on the water in LA. There were 2 subs on the project. One was Language Computer Corporation. They're based out of Dallas, big connections with UT Dallas there. They are also AI and NLP and machine learning people. And then my company, Worthwhile Research and Consulting, was the other sub. So we were tasked with, on this project, creating solutions for natural language processing of metaphor. There had not been a lot of money put in this before. And then the government said, metaphor gives a lot of cultural insights. We're going to throw money at this and see what we can get in terms of systems. So we brought linguistic anthropology into computational linguistics, and this helped us solve challenges posed by the funder, particularly in the last year of the program. But before we talk about this, I want to just give some background on metaphors. Unless you studied linguistics at Berkeley, did anybody do that? We're so close. Okay. So if you studied linguistics at Berkeley, you learned about metaphor from a linguistics perspective. If you didn't, you haven't.
Yeah, you did.
Oh, what?
I studied at UT.
Oh, great. And very infrequently, you can do that too. Yeah, UT Austin's a great place for that too. Okay, so metaphors are not just colorful literary expressions. They're also understood to be cognitive models. And I am now in these 4 bullet points going to summarize 40 years or more of research by cognitive scientists into metaphor. So just trust me that it is believed that metaphors permeate thought, speech, and writing, that they're mostly used unknowingly. What we found in our corpus was that people did seem to know that they were using, especially people writing colorfully for a newspaper, and then you find that the metaphors tend to be in quotes, right? But generally, they're so permeate everyday speech that they're used in a way that people don't realize they're invoking metaphors. And this is because metaphors compare categories and scenarios. So it looks like something very basic about human cognition is that we understand something new and complex to us in terms of something more basic and known to us. So the older I get, the more I meet people and I slot them into people I already know. I don't know if you're getting there. So too with metaphor, it looks like. There's something new and you understand it in terms of what you already know. And then metaphors also are part of culture. So when you're in anthropology, you're pretty careful about what you say in terms of culture, but a nice sort of neutral definition is a shared set of understandings, and metaphors absolutely contribute to that. So when you go from one cultural domain to another, you might find different kinds of metaphorical uses showing different kinds of frameworks and categories and understandings of the world. So this is what the USG wanted to investigate, and then they said, we're going to fund a big project on this. So the traditional understanding of metaphorical structure is that there's a more abstract, complex target domain, so that new thing you're encountering and a more complex thing, that's mapped to a more concrete, basic source domain. In the end, I put basic in quotes because sometimes it's not that basic anymore, but something that's closer to home, more common. So George Lakoff calls this a cross-domain mapping in the conceptual system. Briefly, I'll give an example. Time and space. So time is a little more complex than space. We tend to, almost all our words about time are actually words that are from space and develop metaphorically to talk about time. Before, after, in front of us, behind us. It's almost impossible to talk about time without actually using words of space, and that's because of metaphor and grammaticalization. So I'm going to get technical again. When you actually study metaphor, you don't just use the word metaphor in an unqualified way. You say either it's a linguistic metaphor or a conceptual metaphor. So a linguistic metaphor is an expression in which a word or phrase brings together two domains. So the example here, I've highlighted it in almost every slide, the metaphorical word or phrase will be bolded. So a battleground state in the upcoming presidential election, right? So battleground is invoking the idea of war, and it's mapping the target domain of politics to the source domain of war. I actually started working on this project in 2012, right at the end of an election cycle. I can't believe that I'm giving this talk, and already the news is dominated by another election cycle. It seems like there's no rest. So these are linguistic metaphors are at the linguistic level, things that are spoken or written. Conceptual metaphors are, think of them as sort of a category, an abstract category that are in the mind. Cognitive models in which one domain is understood in terms of another. So the convention is you write them in small caps, I don't know why. So politics is war. So you've got this category for which the evidence is a series of linguistic metaphors. After you get enough linguistic metaphors, you can say it looks like there's this cognitive model in the mind that can explain all of these metaphors. Okay, now a target is then understood in terms of a source, and the source brings entailments. So, for example, with the conceptual metaphor, politics is war, we've got these entailments from war that are then applied to politics. There are opposing sides. There are battlefields and battles. Politicians are understood as soldiers or officers. The outcome is victory or defeat. Only one side wins. I've tried to think about American politics without using the war metaphor, and I find it impossible. Yeah?
Do you see yourself ever making a column of target and source to try to also map out different words? So like opposing sides, even though it works on both, like in my mind it weighs more heavily on war because there's a physical sense of opposing sides, but politics, are there like, do you find particular words that really highlight opposing sides, for example?
That's a really good question, and that wasn't really the focus of the project, but I do have the database at hand that I'm hoping to mine and publish on, so that's something for me to think about. Our goal, well, you'll see what our goal was. Our goal was at a slightly different level than the word level. We were going for more structural stuff, but that's a really interesting question. I'll think about it and see if I come back to it if it shows up. So the project turned out to be a 3-year project, as I said, and for years 1 and 2, it was almost all system development, right? It was, the requirements were, please develop a system that does metaphor mapping and identification. Identification first, then metaphor mapping. So we had to develop a system that could identify the presence of a linguistic metaphor in a sentence such as from a New York paper, but Bloomberg prefers the heavy hammer of law. This was a soda tax, okay? This came in also discussion of the nanny state, which is also a metaphor. So we needed to build a system that could identify the target, in this case law, map the target to the source, tool, right? And then identify also which stretch of language was metaphorical. And to make things even more exciting, there were 4 languages that we had to do this in, not just English. So it was English, Spanish, Farsi, and Russian. So 4 languages, 3 alphabets, 1 system. It was a lot of work. So for the first 2 years, there were certain kinds of contributions that my team, I ran the social science team. So what did we bring in terms of the project? We did a lot of research to identify the groups producing the metaphorical texts. If you were going to identify stances and ideas, you had to figure out who the people were. For the American context, we all were living in the States, so it was pretty clear, but what about Russia or Iran or Mexico? So we went and did research, I hired experts, we figured out who was where, and then we also gave guidance for locating relevant texts outside of established corpora. The token frequency for metaphors is very infrequent, especially if you're looking for ones about a particular source. So you can run through established corpora like that. So we had to build web crawlers and go out and find our data. So we gave guidance for good places to find the data. We also did some collaborative work on target site ontologies that was later discontinued. I worked a lot with Ed Hovey, who's now at CMU. He was at USC at the time. And then we did a lot of data validation using interviews and surveys. This was actually required by the funder. The program manager said, you can't have data until it's been proven, unless you've got a gold standard set of data where people who are native speakers of the language said, yes, this is how it works. So we spent really the bulk of our time doing that. Year 3 brought an interesting shift in the funder requirements. And suddenly, I don't think it was suddenly to the program manager, but to us it seemed suddenly, cross-cultural comparison suddenly to us became central. And so this meant that there was a shift in our project structure. originally when we were doing cultural comparisons, they seemed sort of adjunct, and they were among the 4 languages. So for most of year 3, we actually moved to a case study, and we tried to figure out how to compare 2 sides in a political or cultural debate, compare their metaphorical usage. The project was actually supposed to go for 5 years, and phase 2 was going to be entirely case study oriented. And then 4 business days before the renewal date, the project was canceled. Not because of performance issues, but internal agency issues. So that was going to be, we were prepped and ready to go, and it was going to be all case study work. The case study turned out to be the gun rights, gun control debate in the US. There is a lot of metaphorical text. I would like to do metaphorical work on something less stressful to read about. And anyway, and so we were tasked with not only finding directly contrastive, and the term was meaningful differences, not only finding these in the metaphors, but to have them be generated by the system. So it wasn't just have humans look at the database and find it, but find a way to have the system that was originally developed only for metaphor ID and mapping, and to turn it into something that could recognize when there were interesting differences and present them. So the original system structure made this a little difficult at first. So all of the research teams were provided with a small set of targets by the funder. So you couldn't just randomly choose what were, in part to make it so it was always something of interest to the funder, to the government, but also to make it so that if you were doing an evaluation, you could evaluate all the teams on the same small set. So we looked at things like governance, election, poverty, taxation, democracy. What's metaphorical talk in Mexico about democracy versus Russia, right? Then we would all suggest sources, the source domains that would work with these targets, and then they were compiled into a canonical list. None of the teams were happy with the list, but it's what we had to work with. So we were given lists like, okay, abyss, body of water, building, disease. These were the source domains, and so we would have an area of focus. The thing that was most problematic for me was that we were constrained to a flat structure when we were doing the metaphor mapping target and source domains. We could only really say, when you found a sentence, you could only say the target domain is X and the source domain is Y, and almost an equal sign, and that was it. It was sort of an atomic level thing. We weren't allowed to go subatomic, and we weren't allowed to go molecular, right? It was just here. Okay, so there were things that I'm unkindly calling conceptual metaphors that were not conceptual metaphors, that were basically just an equal sign. Democracy equals tool. Here are sentences with the conceptual metaphor, democracy equals tool, right? Or democracy is disease, or democracy is a physical burden. But they weren't conceptual metaphors. They were just saying, this exists and this exists. In addition, if we were doing cross-linguistic comparison, it was almost all quantitative. I come from a qualitative place, right? So for me, presence, absence, and frequency were fine, but they weren't telling enough. So the 2 issues that I had were they weren't really conceptual metaphors, and they also didn't capture the different mappings. There can be lots of mappings between a target and source, and if you're at the atomic level, those aren't being captured. So here are some traditional conceptual metaphors. You'll notice they don't have equal signs. So time is money, you may have heard that one. That now is an expression too, right? So she spends her time unwisely, or the diversion should buy him some time, or difficulties or impediments to travel. He's got a rocky road ahead of him. These are all from classic metaphor work. Competition is a race. We've been playing chess for years and he's finally pulling ahead of me, right? So it's about a different kind of target domain mapping. In addition, the equal sign would work for sentences like this. So here's a set of linguistic metaphors where democracy equal disease, okay. So far from being the symptoms of democracy, one which they use to spread the cancer of democracy. Democracy is an infection, right? So traditionally phrased, you can call that democracy as a disease. That's unproblematic. But what about sentences like these, okay? So from our Russian corpus, how to cure democracy of the cancer of incompetence that's killing it. Or, esta democracia que sangra por heridas centenares. This democracy that has had bleeding wounds for centuries. By the way, injuries were lumped in with disease, which was also not right. So, democracy equals disease, question mark? No, right? Democracy isn't a disease. The domain is disease, but the mapping isn't disease. Here, the conceptual metaphor is democracy as a person suffering from disease. So with the flat structure, we couldn't capture something like that, but that's a really important difference. A disease versus a person suffering from a disease is a significant difference. So with the flat structure, we were losing different mappings between target and source. We were losing differences in roles within a source domain, like agency. Was a target being mapped to an agent or a patient? That can be a really big difference. Is the person, is it the doing or being done to? Differences in affect. Is the target presented as positive or negative? If you want to make a cross-cultural comparison, just disease isn't enough. Disease, I think unless you're a virus, we're not going to look at disease being positive, right? But you can feel positively about person suffering from a disease. But all of these things need to be taken into account and systematized if we were going to be generating cross-cultural comparisons. And the two things were both that it had to be meaningful and it had to be automatic, right? So it became clear to me that I was going to have to work with my team to develop new categories. Categories that would provide meaningful differences that would be clear not only to experts but also to novices. We didn't know who the end user was going to be, and you had to assume that the person that was going to sit down and run a query or read a report might not know anything about their region, about linguistics, about metaphor. Things had to be intuitive and comprehensible. I suspect you deal with stuff like this all the time, right? Translation for the novice end user. In addition, I had to think about, I had clients within my team. I had to create categories that would be used by my NLP and AI people and machine learning people, give them something to hang on to so they could actually work and generate a system that would find these categories and map them to sentences automatically. So they had to be coded into a system that they could automatically generate reports, and then after machine learning, so they could be automatically applied to new data. So I had two different client sets in mind when I had to deal with that. What I learned with a lot of data is that it was better, at least in this circumstance, to think about metaphor structure as a framework. And so I set up a framework in which each source has a conceptual schema. I'm going to show you one on the next page, so it's not going to be too abstract. A conceptual schema with roles and actions. So rather than this sort of atomic space, it seemed more like people were not going to presume what's going on in people's minds, but a way you could describe it on paper and capture the functionality was people seemed to be thinking about a scene that had sort of a background and roles and actions, objects and actions, important things going on. And that a target wasn't mapped to the scene as a whole, but mapped to some component in the scene, which might also be an action. And I called this schematic mapping. So here, as promised, is a conceptual schema for disease, which we were already talking about. So I want to say that I was able, and my team was able, to do a kind of analysis, thanks to NLP, that was, I think, previously impossible in the world of metaphor study. Acquiring data is so laborious that you can only do very small scale analysis. I had the luxury of, I don't know how for disease, but tens of thousands of sentences in 4 languages that I was able to query in the database and sort certain ways. So without NLP boosting me up to a particular level, I could never have done this analysis. So I want to sort of give that acknowledgement right up front. Okay, so thousands of sentences all fit into this conceptual schema and never went outside of it. The conceptual schema is a person has a disease, which is a threat to health and well-being. A doctor or other professional may try to treat the disease using medicine. If the medicine works, it's a cure. And so what we find is that there is a very small set, in this case, 5 roles that a target is mapped to, and no more. So once you have a closed set, suddenly, if you're working from a computational perspective, this gives you something to hang on to, right? So the target would be mapped to a person suffering from a disease. Once they're in the medical system, you call them a patient. The disease, doctor or nurse, almost always doctor. Medicine, and then I separated out cure because people metaphorically talked about medicine that may or may not work differently from medicine that definitively works. Okay, so in the framework, the source domain is at the center, but the framework extends upwards and downwards. So I guess subatomic and molecular, to keep on with my own metaphor. So at the lower level of granularity, roles like the ones that I just showed you in the source domain, like patient and doctor. At the higher level, I found that it was useful computationally to group sources into ontological categories that shared skeletal components, right? To try to find sort of natural classes or ways that things could be grouped together. So how it all hung together at the end we had around 70 sources, right? So you don't want something that's running reports on 70 atomic sources, especially if after one after another they have a skeletal framework in common. So in the end I was able to group them into 14 categories. I was tweaking. I thought that by the end of year 5 we would probably end up with around 20 based on where we were going. So this was something that the more data comes in, this is not canonical, it's expected to change as more data comes in. Almost all categories have a single schema, a high-level schema that's underspecified that I called the UBO schema, just because I wanted to. And a target would be schematically mapped to one of a small set of roles for the domain, just like I showed you. So that set of 5, that happened at the Uber schema level too, at a more abstract level. I'm going to skip motivational primitives for now. We can get to them if we need to. So here are the 14 source categories at Project M that I had, and you can feel that they're sort of basic at a human experiential level. So health and safety, journey, those two account for, I would say, almost 50% of metaphors generated in talk about politics and culture. I mean, unbelievably a lot. Conflict, power and control, that's about God or enslavement usually. Engineering and business, people build things. Projects are conceived of as buildings all the time. Morality and justice, especially criminals, etc. So,
High and low.
what's that?
High and low.
Oh, high and low. I hate it. I don't want to talk about it. I was forced to deal with the metaphors. Basically, a lot of something metaphorically we talk about as being high, and a little of something we talk about as being low. And when you get more of something, it moves to higher. And when you get less of something, it moves to lower. And it is so basic that there's no cultural variation, but I was forced to, because of the canonical source list, account for it in my framework. So,
Nouns and pronouns.
yeah, all of it. So more, less, higher, lower. We've moved to, I can't even think of them now because I tried to pretend they didn't exist. So let's just move that aside and concentrate on the actually interesting ones that I did because I like them. Because I had to. So health and safety, turns out this schema, it has 16 sources, and we would have had more except our canonical source list didn't include some things. So I'm picking this because I've been talking about disease, and this is where disease fits into. The higher level category is health and safety, right? So there's this Uber schema which accounts for every single linguistic metaphor in every single of the 4 languages for every single one of these sources. Right? It gets very elegant. The human brain is amazing. And so here's this lovely, elegant thing that every single metaphor mapped to some component of this very basic schema. It's desirable to maintain the well-being of a body. Some things in the world are beneficial for human health and safety. Other things are threats which may be mitigated. And I'm going to tell you right now, people don't talk about the beneficial things. It's threats that get people moving into metaphorical language. Opposition, threats, problems, this is what seems to really engender metaphors, at least in these target domains. So the Uber schema is underspecified, and each source brings its own entailments and specificity. So if the metaphor is parasite, that's a different kind of threat to well-being than fire, right? Or a body of water. Here it would be something like a flood or tsunami. Immigrants are talked about as flooding. Not by everybody.
Why are disease and medicine separate?
Oh, God, because of a late stage change. I know. See, now that I'm released from the constraints of the project, I can't tidy it up because this really was what was in there. But it's this constraint of we moved the field ahead in NLP for metaphor so far. We did so much great stuff, but we also had these weird relics of things that people just made us deal with. So that's just weird. Sorry. Yeah, I couldn't choose the sources, so hands up, not my fault. Okay, so let's just talk about the mappings again. So I was talking about with those disease mappings, well, we could go with one level more of abstraction. So for health and safety, the mappings were only one of 4 ways. Again, so a nice closed set that you could then use to code into. A threat, a threatened entity, a mitigator, or a beneficial thing. So threat is a disease, right? Threatened entity is person suffering from a disease. Mitigator would be medicine or a doctor, right? So I just went through the bottom part of that. All right, I think I'll skip, we'll just do journey briefly. Journey also is, it's almost impossible to talk about a long-scale project and a goal without using journey metaphors. It's almost progress is metaphor. So here the Uber schema is a person on a journey wants to reach their destination. Some things facilitate movement towards a destination, other things hinder movement. And we talk more about hindrances metaphorically than we do about facilitators. It just seems angry people seem to go into metaphorical speech more than unhappy people. People who are okay with the status quo tend to have more literal talk about a given status quo than people who want to change the status quo, which I think in itself is interesting. So with these ontological groupings, I gave them to my team, and it turned out that there were real benefits. One thing was that it was this nice coherent framework for the schematic mappings. So it became more powerful. Instead of having these atomized sources, those 16 sources, right, you could just say, here are all the ways that the target is presented as a threat. Here are all the ways the target is presented as threatened. It becomes much more powerful to have that aggregation. It also helped us with some technical issues, so not to complain again, but we had, for example, as sources, we had battle and struggle and war. And the system was expected to take a given sentence and decide which one it should go to. I promise you, it's almost, there's almost nothing that is obviously battle versus struggle. And plus, battle is subordinate to war, so what do you do with that? But if you aggregate, then it doesn't really matter which particular source it went into. If you're saying threat or conflict or aggressor, right, then suddenly these technical issues at this level become obscured. It's not so problematic because you're presenting data at this level of aggregation. And these were easier for end users to understand. It's easy to understand this democracy is threatened or democracy is a threat is intuitive to a novice end user. So I can only talk briefly. So there were two groups that were working on this. At ISI, the computational linguists tended to use abduction-based metaphor interpretation, right? So I worked with them a lot on schematic annotations. It was manual, and then it was going to scale up in phase 2, which then got cut off. So they took the Uber schema and they represented it as a vector of label slots that would be instantiated with values, and the values were either null, excerpted text, or a closed set of primitives like the ones that I was showing you, right? So here for health and safety, just to keep on pushing through with the example, the fields were stage, polarity, body, and agent, just 4 fields. And then 2 were closed set, so stage was potential, active, or effect. And then polarity was all about structure, increase, maintain, or decrease. And then body and agent would be open for any given sentence. So here's an example. This is how irrationally fearful are of guns some people are. Web text is not edited, but you can still use it. I mean, it's still useful. This is from a gun forum. So the stage is potential, polarity is decreased structure, the body is some people, the agent is firearms. And so the annotation tells the story and the structure of the metaphor. Guns instantiated as firearms cause a potential decrease in structure to some people, which is why they're a disease and therefore a threat. And we were also working on a way to take each sentence and then run it through, not like a pipeline, but run it through something that would actually reinterpret it and lay bare the metaphorical structure of the sentence so people could see it and understand what was happening. But that got shut down too. There's Journey, I think we can skip it.
Can I ask you a question about that one?
Yeah, sure.
I don't think I understand for that example, sorry, the other one.
This one?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it not, it seems like there's a performance metaphor here with tragedy and travesty.
Yeah.
I don't think I actually see disease in this case.
Exposure.
I clearly see health and safety for the
Exposure.
fact that
I didn't highlight it. I'm sorry. Exposure.
Oh, and exposure.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. The one thing I didn't put the bold in. Yeah.
Okay.
So exposure is a word that when we were doing the semantic fields was almost always associated with disease, so it
Okay.
got ID'd as a disease
Thanks,
metaphor.
that's helpful.
Sorry, that's my fault. The one bold I didn't do. There you go. LCC over in Dallas, I didn't work with this closely, in part because they were in Dallas. So what they did was they manually created semantic syntactic patterns with minimal effort that would detect instances of frames at high precision. We actually had surprisingly good precision and recall for this by the end. I was really surprised. They used dependency parsers and distributional similarity methods to match patterns in the text to the corpus. And then they combined it with the established for 2 years, and it was always being improved, that system for metaphor detection in order to categorize metaphors in this framework. So we built on the already established repository corpus and system to add this kind of coding on top of it. And I want to say that they did this automated mapping system, over LCC did, that was absolutely integral to a demo that we were required to do that resulted in both a repository and cross-cultural comparison. Let me talk about the demo for a minute. We were given 4 weeks notice. I don't know how often you guys have to do demos, but 4 weeks is horrible. And it was supposed to be standalone.
Horrible.
Oh no, really? But it was supposed to be, we couldn't even BS it because you couldn't implement it in PowerPoint because it was supposed to be standalone. So they could go and take it away and say to people, hey, we've been throwing money at people, for years working on Metaphor, and look at this great demo. We got 4 weeks. So we were down to 3 teams, and we went to DC for our December team meeting, and 2 teams did one kind of process for this kind of cross-cultural comparison, and ours did another one. And so the other 2 teams, very high-level teams doing excellent work, couldn't get the system to be automated for the cross-cultural comparison. They blatantly, obviously did not, right? So their system process was that everyone had good benchmarks for precision and recall, the automated system for mapping Metaphor, right, to doing the ID and the mapping. Then everyone had experts, extensive human intervention. Then they wrote up and said, here's what a system would do to do cross-cultural analysis. The system would, and everyone was implemented in PowerPoint, and it was sort of ad hoc and limited scale. They chose a small component of what was going on. These are super smart people, but the task was incredibly hard. For our team, we were so pleased, and she put us last because she knew ours worked, right? So it was like, didn't work, the flop sweat on the forehead, I felt so bad. And then we were like, hey, we did it. So all of our human intervention was up front, right? So we developed the categories, did the coding, did the system coding, got the system really pretty well working, then put all of that framework on the already established system for Metaphor ID and mapping, and then had the system do automatically the cross-cultural comparison. It was systematic, it covered every target, covered every source, so every dimension was covered. It was usable for all established domains, and we even made it so that it would take on new target domains, right? And I want to say that the difference between the 2 teams, one of the big differences was they didn't have linguistic anthropology and we did. They didn't have that intermediate framework that people could work and code to, and we did.
They did all their systems separately.
Yeah.
And you guys had a unifying sort of language independent framework.
Yeah, we did. We did, because I did all the research that I did was I had all the cross-linguistic data. So I only designed a framework that would work with all of the languages. Yeah, and in fact, their systems also were more English focused. So I used to be able to access the demo system, and we could run queries live, but I can't do that anymore because it lives with the government now, right? But I have some screenshots. These are real screenshots, and I think you can kind of see some of them. So this is a query. So this is about the gun control debate. So this is looking at from the side of people who are for gun control. Against gun control. It's called individual oversight. These are the gun rights people. So if you look, how is gun control being talked about in the framework of morality and justice? Gun control is seen as a criminal. So if you're on a gun control forum and you're writing from the perspective of gun rights, you're going to write often using metaphors comparing gun control to a criminal. Gun control kills every time it's tried. It destroys. It's an assault. It steals freedom. It victimizes the people it's designed to protect. Okay? So that's a real query from our demo system, the interface. Or gun rights are threatened. So this is again from the perspective of people who are for gun rights. So the destruction of the Second Amendment. Protect your gun rights. Defend gun rights. A negative impact on gun rights, right? So this is how it looked. We also were working towards reports that looked like this, that you could then drill down, that would do a direct comparison between the sides, side by side. So if you look here, this is the perspective of people for gun control. This is the perspective of people for gun rights. So if you're looking in something is a threat, so let's say gun control is a threat, if you're pro-gun control, you have literally 0 metaphors saying gun control is a threat, right? But if you're for gun rights, you have, I redacted, there's more, right? Gun control is an addictive substance, it's a contaminant, it's a disease, it causes bodily harm, it's a monster, it's a demon, it's a parasite, there's more. And then the idea is you would be able to click and then see example sentences for all of these. By contrast, you can see that if you are talking about guns and mapping them to being a threat, that the gun control people see guns as a threat, And the one thing that happened is people will talk about guns as addictive, and it would be a particular brand of gun, right? Oh, I'm totally addicted to my blah blah. I can't even name a gun, sorry. My fancy gun that I really like. In case you're wondering, which side of the gun debate is she on? Meanwhile, my niece is half Texan, and she already has 2 guns waiting for her in Texas. So, anyway, so you can see, so this kind of contrast shows really very clearly, metaphors are really showing you sort of the skeletal framework of a debate, right? You can very quickly see what's going on in a debate, and if you want a really good insight into how people are positioning themselves for the gun control debate, this is a great way of doing it.
Can I ask a question about
Of
that?
course.
How did you divide the pro-gun and pro-gun control and pro-gun rights?
Do you mean
Posts?
who, the system was trained, LCC did this, with help of, so we gave linguistic and anthropological input as to who was associated with what language, and then LCC developed a system to automatically identify through text on a page, through whatever they were doing, to identify, we were calling it protagonist, which I don't really love, but the system automatically identified, they also collected metadata so it could be checked up on, but the system automatically identified based on vocabulary which side somebody was in, and then the metaphor got in the database automatically tagged as associated with one side or the other.
So this is another classification.
Yeah, it is another classification. So I helped with the input, but I didn't help with the development of that. And there are some things that are problematic. So for example, Gabby Giffords was shot and now has a pro-gun control thing, but also is in Arizona and owns guns. So a lot of stuff on their website for the foundation, Pro-Gun Control Foundation, says a lot of good things about guns. So it does get sort of complex for protagonist identification, but you want that complexity to be, you want most people to generally fit in. People who go to the internet to write about guns and gun control identify themselves pretty clearly for the most part. So some conclusions from the case study that we found, and I've sort of alluded to this already, even in general, but particularly when there's a debate on a given topic that people feel strongly about, the metaphors that are generated are mostly about threats and being threatened, hindrances to a journey. So you want to get here, a safe America. Everybody in the gun control debate wants a safer America, and there are 2 vastly different perspectives on what the pathway is to get there, right? And potentially being oppression and lack of autonomy. There's a lot of Nazi and Soviet talk about the right about gun control, and potentially being victims of crime. So these, again, seem to be fear or anger-based metaphor about a given topic. Schematic mappings with positive stances are very infrequent. And control, a case study conclusion 2 is, on both sides of the debate, the same targets are being mapped to the same sources, right? So if we were stuck with that atomic structure, we would never been able to capture. So on both the gun control and the gun rights side, guns and protection are being mapped, right? But for the gun control side, guns are a threat, which people require protection from. And on the gun rights side, guns are threat mitigators and protect people. So with this kind of framework, we were able to automatically code things and present that kind of difference. I think I'll skip that. Let's just say NLP makes it so that you can really, really analyze cross-cultural differences in a way that people who don't have access to it haven't been able to. The scale is very small for everything right up to about now. NLP is changing metaphor study. It's really great. So, interdisciplinary collaboration. So it seemed to me, especially looking at the other teams who had brilliant people but weren't able to solve the problem, we were given this task in, automatically generate meaningful cross-cultural comparisons of metaphor use. That's a really high level and fuzzy problem if you are a computer scientist, right? What's meaningful? They weren't defining meaningful, they weren't. So somebody else had to come in and define meaningful, and that was where we came in, the social science. So this framework of metaphorical structure became an intermediate level problem. Here's the client problem, super fuzzy. Here's the system result, very specific. We needed this intermediate level problem in order to give computer scientists something they could actually solve. So Jerry Hobbs was PI on the project, and he said, linguistic anthropology can take complex abstract problems that people need solved and bring them into a framework that can yield to a computational approach.
By using objective reasoning.
Yeah, yeah, but he teamed up with non-objective people, right? So to conclude, the powerful tools of NLP facilitate linguistic and linguistic anthropological analysis. Large quantities of data and the ability to sort and query data are luxuries that people in my field have not really had before, except people with corpus linguistics, but they tend to do fewer cultural things. Maybe it's different now, but based on when I would look at things. Then it's this nice dialogue. Then linguistic anthropology can further facilitate NLP. So we can apply established concepts to new data, but we can also look at data and establish new categories, ontologies or frameworks that are useful for structuring and querying databases. So my conclusion, which was also my beginning, is that computer scientists and linguistic anthropologists should collaborate more often because we get better results. Thanks.
I have a question that goes to one of the first things you said about metaphor.
Uh-huh.
You were talking about the idea of how do you deal with something new? And I want to sort of ask about that, since a lot of the examples are actually kind of not about encountering something new, per se, but things that are just out there in the world maybe are hard to understand. And I want to ask this more specifically about the contrast between something like freedom, which is a super contested term, right? So you have lots of different metaphors around freedom. And something else that is kind of less obviously contested in a political sphere, like love, but which people can clearly come to different conclusions and use different metaphors depending on, like, well, is their love relationship going well or poorly? And like, also just as you get older, you have more different experiences, so you might just come to understand that whole domain differently than you ever imagined, earlier on. And so I guess I'm curious about, I'm asking you to speak to, what does it mean to encounter something new?
I guess my answer to that would be my terminology was maybe less precise than it should have been. And I think that your understanding of this is superior. And so rather than new, maybe the focus should be on something multifaceted, complex, and more abstract, and possibly contested. And those do seem to be the areas where people do seem to reach for metaphors more when they're writing and speaking about it. And that metaphor use can really uncover these different understandings. So one of the things that's interesting to me about metaphor, so I was trained in metaphor somewhat in grad school, ignored it pretty much for however many years, was invited to be on this project, thought this project is crazy. Like, my first thought when I was invited, I was like, this can't be done. And then I thought, no, say yes, you never know. And then it turned out that people, AI and NLP people, were doing great stuff. And I'm like, oh my God, we're doing it. I was shocked. But it was just then, once the metaphor filter is on, it never comes off, and you're living your life walking around being like, I can't handle this, there's so much metaphor. But something that's so nice, especially from the anthropological perspective, is it's a nice way of sort of, when people disagree or coming at things from a different perspective, if you have this nice concrete mapping, it starts to help you understand what the differences are in assumptions or expectations or mappings. So if you're looking at love from a boxing standpoint, like you read stuff where sometimes people are talking about things in a very antagonistic way, and then there are other metaphors, you could be like, okay, let's unpack the way you're looking at things. So yeah, so I should just take new out. I'm spending a lot of time with young children lately, so the new is a little more highlighted than usual. But grown people, but that's by the time you're a grown person, you have been socialized into the metaphorical system, frameworks, and categories of the people that you've been speaking with. That's why you have cross-cultural contrast. So let me tell you briefly, Russians talk about democracy as a disease and a threat way more than anybody else, right? So that might not be a surprise. But in Mexico, even in Iran, people are like, democracy, we can talk about it, right? But so many threatening metaphors about democracy in Russia. So that's really interesting if you want to do diplomatic work with Russia. That's a nice thing it's a nice starting place.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised by the finding you showed about prevalence of metaphor in negative language.
Me too.
It seems unintuitive to me. Do you think that's because you guys were restricted to a domain, right? It's mostly
Mostly political domains, yeah. We had
So
about
if
10
you were-
targets, yeah.
If you were looking at, say, I don't know, something more academic like philosophy or biology writings or medical writing, do you think you Is your intuition that you would find the same thing?
My intuition is not, because that's why I tried to be qualified. I'm not saying generally anger generates more metaphorical speech. It seems that in particular when people are, because political and cultural debates are felt on an individual level, right? That's why people care to write and go out and rally and stuff. And so I think that it's fear or frustration when people are actually, I will tell you also that the amount of text generated is
More
different.
negative.
No, just the amount. Okay, so let's say there's the gun control, gun rights debate in the U.S. People on the gun control side, let's say, produce that much text. People on the gun rights side produce that much text. So would that even be the case for something more abstract or less personally felt? It seems unlikely to me. Or like we were talking about love or freedom, it seems implausible to me that it would be so very negative for things that are viewed as so aspirational and positive. So I'm speaking here specifically about status quos and political and cultural debates. Yeah.
Did you have a time component within your study? I just thought it would be interesting to track how metaphors are changing over time and whether people start talking different ways about different concepts.
Yeah, we wanted to have that component. Among the metadata that we were collecting was time of writing, right? So to make sure that if we wanted to go longitudinal, we could. We wanted to expand into that dimension in the years to come, and then the funding went away. So it was something we talked about, we considered, it seemed interesting. If you're doing a web crawling, most of our data was from a web crawler, that already limits the longitudinal, just your access to data, right? So most everything was 1995 and up. And then I had to periodically weed things out. I'm like, this is from the Federalist Papers, so let's not use that as a modern American metaphor because it's from the 18th century, or like, hey, this is Pushkin, so let's not include him in modern Russian conceptions of, like, so I would go through and we would check data. I think it's a great idea and I would love to do it, and if we could find funding. Not a lot of people fund metaphor work, but there's so much interesting stuff, so it's a great question. Is there, yeah.
Do you have any other examples of the types of cross-cultural differences that you found in the metaphors? Like you brought up the democracy as disease in Russia. Are there any other kind of obvious big things that come to mind?
Let me just see if I can use this as a... Americans are very concerned about being enslaved. And these did not seem to be Black Americans. So there seems to be, this should not be a surprise, but so in power and control, there were people in far worse working circumstances in every other country that we were gathering metaphorical data from, but fear of enslavement and oppression was very prevalent in American discourse and not in Mexican discourse. People outside of America look to the natural world a lot more. That's not so culturally insightful, but you're gonna find a lot more metaphors in Russian that I didn't even, like I speak Russian. I'm like, the cow with the what? Like there's a lot more closeness to nature still. There's a lot more active animal and nature metaphors going on in other places. So we had to call in people who were native speakers just to be like, I don't understand this fox. Why I don't understand what's happening. It's almost universal that darkness and light. It's interesting because we were like, well, what about a desert culture? Maybe sunshine's not so great, Like maybe in Iran, sunshine, no, so far in Iran, like sunshine, people like sunshine. It's not like darkness makes it hard to see because darkness and light actually tended to come a lot with journey, and darkness would obstruct your journey and light would help your journey. Trying to think of anything else. Everyone seems to look at politics as a conflict. Everyone wants to be in control. a lot of people want to tear down a structure that was built. So you would think that metaphors would be, but if you don't like the structure that was built, there's a lot of destruction metaphors, but those are more in debates than I would say cross-culturally. So I'm sorry, I wish I had more fun stuff. But by the time we were doing real comparison, it was really focused on the gun debate, which I will reiterate is not fun. Yeah.
Do you think high and low could be interpreted for math? Because that is kind of, I would think math for being like the universal language.
When said high and low?
Yeah, it's okay. No, it's just basically, so let me give you another metaphorical distinction. So someone I went to school with wrote a dissertation that's still super cited today, and he works on metaphor too. He was on another team. And he separated out primary metaphors from other metaphors. And his idea was that primary metaphors would be basically universal, that you weren't going to find cross-cultural variation because they were so central to embodied human experience. And high-low is one of them. So from our perspective, a primary metaphor should have just been cut out of the data because everyone will have it and it's not going to vary, right? Because in an embodied world, more of something piles higher and less of something is lower. So it just was, I'm not against them, they exist, but they didn't give insights the way that morality and justice, talking about a criminal versus a victim, those give you real insights, especially if you're trying to think about diplomatic work or removing cultural bias. Yeah, I can talk about high and low, it's okay. I'm not bitter. We ended in April, you know, like I meditate, I like that.
But I mean, I think you've answered why do mirrors reverse left and right and not top and bottom, and it's exactly that embodiment.
Yeah.
I'm curious, this seems like maybe something that you would have time for in this particular study, but one thing that I think is super interesting is when metaphors become very domain specific. So, I mean, I think that is true for a particular topic, which seems like the level of granularity that you're talking about here. But I think also within the scope of a certain community, there are ways of speaking about things, and then even more narrowly within the scope of like a particular conversation or a particular forum. Like once somebody makes a metaphorical reference to something, then I think other people are pretty likely to pick this up and to start using that specific word and that concept as if it is like very literally true, right? Even though that might not have been a conception that they even knew about before this context. Do you know about any research that looks into this, like kind of the generalizing of metaphor, or like how metaphors propagate?
You know, I don't. I'm going to say two things. One is that, so I'm thinking as you're saying that, I'm nodding and I'm sitting here looking at a lot of computers, and I think about the debate about, do you know where I'm going? With slave, right? So in a particular domain involving servers, the word slave was, and that domain was mostly white, East Asian and South Asian, right? And so slavery was, you know, actual enslavement, having a great-grandfather or great-grandmother who was enslaved was not, or grandmother, depending on how old you are, was not a viable thing. And then as the terminology moved further out into the world, then a debate emerged about it, right? So this was something that had propagated out to becoming standard terminology involving servers and slave server. And then you had a whole cultural debate, I mean, pretty small, but about it. So the thing I would...
migrating our names to primary, secondary.
There you go. Yeah, and the thing is, why not? Like, you know, why not? Like, when it wasn't offending people, yeah, okay, like it was in a protected little bubble, and then once it is, hey. Okay, so the thing I want to say is, when you work on sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology, something you think a lot about is, and I also come from a historical linguistics background, so there's innovation, linguistic innovation, and then linguistic diffusion. And that process seems to be similar at various levels of, or various types of linguistic phenomena. So pronouncing something differently, slang, what you're talking about is almost exactly the same as slang, and then slang sometimes goes out and becomes colloquial, right? So it starts in a particular group of people and then works its way outward. When I taught at Northwestern, I had a student from the south side of Chicago who hung out with a lot of gangbangers, right? That was his neighborhood, they were his friends. And then I had a slang assignment, and my class was mostly white. And people, you know, he would just sit there laughing. I was reading the slang, and he's like, that's so 5 years ago. And I'm like, I know. And then I had his assignment, and I said, I wish I had it. It's in my files in my garage somewhere. I said, you understand that the things that your friends are saying on the south side of Chicago in African-American circles right now, and some of them also did hip-hop, I'm like, this is white people slang in Chicago 5 years from now. I'm like, write it down, keep this assignment, and then when people are walking around saying this is your source, right? So these kinds of innovation with metaphor, I think it happens less frequently, or it seems to already fit into frameworks that exist. But I would say the way to study it would be exactly, I gave a talk in Estonia last year at a sociolinguistic symposium, and I said, let's add metaphor to the toolkit, right? I'm gonna give you some data now. When you're looking at a conversation, you're looking at this, add metaphor to the mix, because it's gonna give you stuff. Will anyone listen to me? We'll see. But, it could be done, but because of token frequency, it's much easier to track where people pronounce their vowels, right? So vowel changes spread, and you can track them like that, right? Metaphors, so hard to find. Yeah.
I mean, if you Edgar was suggesting mapping, like with words. I mean, that's a more easy way to track metaphor. You actually have some concrete mappings to syntactic or semantic expressions and words. Then you could actually track things moving around, just stupid keyword searches or something.
Yeah, well, and not only that, but I mean, so the people at LCC, I mean, one of the things about metaphorical language is the unexpectedness. So I wish I had spent more time, but basically it was semantic fields, and then they would rule out things as being metaphorical because of the expectedness of the collocations or engrams or whatever they were using, and so that would be another way of finding the metaphors, but then, only in written.
Yeah, only in written.
Yeah.
Spoken is different.
Yeah, but sometimes it's only field work that gets you into a particular location, right? And then, unless you walk around recording people all the time, that's the worst, because then you have to transcribe it.
Yeah, so how important do you think it should be for people documented in endangered languages to look at metaphor? It sounds like you did that, but that's fairly unique. I don't think I've heard that very much.
Is there even one word about metaphor in my Berkeley dissertation on language endangerment? No. My friend from grad school worked on Hoopa, 3 hours north of here, not spoken that much, in a valley that life was so good that there are 3 genetically unrelated languages in the same valley. There's Hoopa, Karuk, and Yurok, right? And so my dissertation advisor is now working on language revitalization for Karuk and Yurok, right? She wrote a dissertation on metaphor in Hoopa, right? She thought it was really important. Has it had much traction since then? I don't think it has. I think in part because you can almost do a post hoc metaphor analysis, but the important thing is just to keep the language, to either document it in situ at the moment as broadly as possible, and then if you want, if there are metaphors that are different that you feel are part of cultural preservation, right, then you could say, hey, I forget, there's someone in California, for example, that counts in between the fingers. I think it's up north somewhere. So it's not a base 5 system. They've got 10 and 100, right? But they've got a base 4 system. So there might be interesting things happening there. So those are the kinds of things you want to say, this makes us special, right? We have this metaphor of this or that, but it seems that it's not, in a triage situation, it doesn't seem like it's top.